So a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about what contextualization is, and then we're going to be talking about how you move from period 4 into period 5. Keep in mind that period 4, you might be there already, you might be in period 5. It doesn't really matter a whole lot. My students are in the middle of period 5 toward the early end. Don't feel like you're behind or you're super ahead either way. The old teacher advice to each other is to have Lincoln dead by Christmas. And so we still got ourselves quite a while until Christmas. So probably around period 5. Period 5 is probably going to be the last period you will start before Christmas. And if you have exams first semester, this will probably be what it's over. You might get a little bit into period 6 depending on how quickly your teacher works. But either way, period 5 is for sure going to be included on your final exam, so it's a good one to know. We're going to talk about dates and overview and just give you a sense of what period 5 looks like. Alrighty? So let's talk a little bit about period 4, period 5, and contextualization. First, contextualization. Think to yourself how you would define it in your own words. Contextualization, I mean, it has the word context in it, but there are a variety of places you can go to look at contextualization. And there's a variety of avenues we can use to be able to make this work. So how would you define contextualization in your own words? I don't know. I've heard students say things like setting. If they're more familiar with like AP literature, they might say setting the stage. Either way, contextualization is an important skill in AP US history and in the other AP histories. And it might be a good idea to be able to define it in your own words, so that way you can use it well. So we'll be talking about that a little bit, and setting the stage is not a bad way to go about it. What's going on at the time period? You can refer to settings in literature. I like to refer to it as sort of like the overarching stuff that's going on that has to be relevant, but it's not the subject of the prompt or the essay. So when it comes to being relevant, it needs to be tied in with the prompt. You can't just be talking about random stuff. And yet you also want to make sure that it's not the essay prompt itself. If the essay, let's just to go back a little bit and give you a couple examples. If the essay is about Andrew Jackson, you don't want to be talking about the Second Bank of the United States. That's something you want to put in your essay. Contextualization might be what's going on around the time period of Jackson. So you could mention, well, feel free to throw in some suggestions if you'd like to, but market revolution might be one of those. Market revolution is going around at the same time period. Could you talk about why that's relevant? Absolutely. You could talk about how market revolution is happening at the same time as Andrew Jackson, which enables the first political parties to be able to expand and to be able to get their message out there thanks to things like the newspapers getting more efficient, the penny press, et cetera, et cetera. Zainab asks a good question. How far back should you go in time when providing information for contextualization? There's not really enough. I'll tell you this, as a reader for APUSH, there's not an official time period with which you have to stay within. However, I would say rule of thumb, I always tell my students, as you get closer and closer to the time period, it gets better. It can be before, during, or after, technically, according to the rubric. But for contextualization, I like to say about 20 years or so. Again, it changes depending on what period you're in. So if you're, say, in for some reason you're writing a prompt on period 2 or on period 3, you maybe are able to go back a little bit further. But if you're talking about period 6, period 7, those later periods where it starts to get really dense, you don't want to be going back so much because the pace of change, at least according to what we see from our modern perspective, seems to accelerate. So you don't want to go back so far that it's this big stretch. So if I gave you that prompt on Andrew Jackson, let's say, you can't be saying, oh, well, ever since the Columbian Exchange, and then start there. That just wouldn't work. So you want to stay as close as you can. And my advice to my students and my advice to you is always, you want to make sure that you can choose something that's relevant to the prompt. Okay, but what does that mean? I sort of like the idea of a process that happens before and then continues into the prompt. So for example, when we mentioned the Andrew Jackson thing, you could talk about the market revolution because it begins before Jackson's in office and then it continues on while he's in office. That might be a good way to go about it. Just as an example. That's not always possible, but that's another way that perhaps students have found it to be somewhat helpful. So relevant, but not the subject of the prompt or essay. Just to give you a little bit of a heads up of what it's going to look like tonight, I'm basically going to be talking about the lives of African Americans as contextualization for period 5. A lot of stuff happens in period 5. If we're able to look at period 5, see if I can get my mouse working here a second. if you look at period 4 into period 5, there's a whole bunch of stuff about slavery, right? So you want to make sure that you're talking about period 5. Sorry about that. You want to be sure you're talking about period 5 in terms of things that happened beforehand that are also relevant. And we'll be talking about African Americans basically the entire time. I would suggest, if you start with period 4, that you should be able to start with the antebellum reform movements. There's one in particular that I think you should be able to use. What's the antebellum reform movement that would be the most relevant to African Americans if we're about to start talking about the Civil War? Go ahead and throw that in the chat if you think you know what it is. There's a little bit of a hint there in that picture that I'm looking at over here on my screen. Any ideas? Go ahead and throw that in the chat if you think you know what it is. Antebellum reform movements related to the picture of auction and Negro sales. Well, it seems like the chat's a little bit quiet tonight, which is entirely fine. You people, I mean, it's Monday, right? So we're still getting ourselves started. Mahfouz is thinking. All right. Always good to put that thinking cap on, especially early in the week. So, Lena, you got it. Fantastic. Abolitionism. And Zainab, thankfully, we have some people in the chat who are helping us out here. Yeah, abolitionism is going to be the really, really big one. And apologies if you've used some different words for this before. Antebellum reform movements. So this is the period 4 changes that happen in American society. These are the people that are trying to make things better. So this is the Dorothea Dix prison reform. This is the temperance movement reforms, all different types of reforms. And one of them is abolitionism, which, Lena, thank you for getting that. Nice job. Abolitionism is, hey, one of the things that could make society better. How about freeing the slaves, right? So antebellum reform movements, that's going to be a nice transition from period 4 to period 5, because as we'll just see in a second, they overlap a bit. You can also talk about westward expansion and manifest destiny. Remember, as we move west, we have this constant problem of, all right, are these new states going to be free? Are they going to be slave? And that's a constant calculation we have to make. That continues on, even though it starts before. The market revolution, we already mentioned that, but the market revolution and the subsequent industrial revolution are going to be important for the Civil War, because railroads are incredibly important during the Civil War. And railroads come from the market revolution, or the transportation revolution, as some people like to call it sometimes. So that's going to be a big deal as well. We can talk about political parties. The first party system has collapsed by period 4. First party system of Federalists and Democratic Republicans collapses around the Hartford Convention of 1815 or a little bit later. We have the era of good feelings that eventually starts. Oh, sorry, Mahfouz. Yeah. The manifest destiny, that's just this idea that as America moves west, it's bringing civilization and Christianity and all those things. So that's just tied in with westward expansion. So manifest destiny is that the United States should overspread the continent, take over everything from sea to shining sea. The joke I always make is, well, if I want to be more Pacific, you're going from the Atlantic to the Pacific, taking over all of that land, bringing civilization, so-called, and taking over the land, largely favored by Democrats. Political parties tie in there, and they're wanting to expand because if slavery is not expanding, it's dying, and everybody agrees on that. So the Democrats, who have more of a support base in the South, who tend to be more agrarian, this sounds like the party of Jefferson and Jackson, they want slavery to expand, so they're more advocates of manifest destiny. We'll actually get to that in just a second. So sectional tensions continue to grow this entire time. The North and the South tend to be more and more different. A lot of this is going to tie back into slavery, but the sectional tensions are going to result from economic differences, from social differences, from political differences, all of which you can eventually tie back into slavery at some point. So a lot of things tying in with slavery. African Americans are obviously going to be a part of a lot of this. There's the internal slave trade that happens as people move more from Virginia down to the Black Belt in the Antebellum era. So African Americans are going to be a big part of this, especially when it comes to slavery, but not exclusively so. And we'll talk about a few more of those in just a little bit. So period 5 itself, at the center of period 5 is the Civil War, thus the pictures over on the right-hand side. So let's talk real quick, put period 5 in context. And I don't necessarily know where you all are in terms of your classes, but period 5, if you're not there yet, it's going to start in 1844 and go till 1877. Now, some of you who are more astute observers of dates might go, doesn't period 4 end in 1848? And you'd be correct. There's a little bit of an overlap that happens here. This overlaps with period 4 that comes before and period 6 that comes after. And that's very deliberate. These are almost You can almost call them like thematic dates rather than strict chronological dates. Period 4 ends in 1848 because that is the Seneca Falls Convention, women's rights, antebellum reform movement kind of stuff. And so that's a symbolic end for that period. Period 5 begins in 1844 because that's the election of a certain president who really likes manifest destiny and is going to use it to take over places like Texas and Northern California, which is going to be taken from Mexico. Anybody know who the president is who's elected in 1844 and then takes office in 1845? He's one of the antebellum reform movement. He's one of the antebellum presidents that I think you should know. I always tell my students, you should know the Washington through Jackson, the first 7, and then 1, 2, skip a few. But you should know this guy, 1844, and then you should pick it up again with Lincoln and be able to know Lincoln, I'd say, through Rutherford B. Hayes. So that's 16, 17, 18, and 19. 1844 is going to be the election of one James K. Polk. And James K. Polk is a Southern Democrat. He's interested in slavery. He's interested in expansion. And he's interested in manifest destiny as the justification for expansion. So 1844 is going to be a big deal because that's when he's elected. It goes all the way until 1877. 1877 is going to be the end of Reconstruction. So again, I'm just using a word that we didn't really talk about yet, but let me give you this quick overview. So period 5, you can basically break it down into 3 parts. The road to the American Civil War, the Civil War itself, and then the aftermath of the American Civil War, sometimes called Reconstruction. That's its official name because we're trying to reconstruct the country. So road to the American Civil War, obviously we could go back, and we are going to in a little bit. It goes way back, but 1844 is a nice handy starting point for James K. Polk. And then the aftermath of the American Civil War is going to be 1877. And that's when Reconstruction ends and a whole bunch of bad stuff happens that we'll get to a little bit later. So that's period 5 overview in a nutshell, just really, really quick. Let's talk about a little bit more of this, and I'll give you this giant timeline. So I think I've mentioned this in previous streams that I've done, but it's a really good idea when you're studying for APUSH don't just reread your textbook. Don't just reread your notes. Rereading is not an effective study strategy. Effective study strategies would be self-quizzing, things like that. Make your brain work for it and make sure that you're able to work on recalling it, almost like flashcards, really. So if you don't remember it very well, try it again the next time and then see if you can do a little bit better the next time and keep working on it. So we're going to do some self-quizzing here. And I'm not necessarily going to ask you to write them all down in the chat, although feel free if you'd like to. These are some important dates on the road to the Civil War. If you know some dates, it's often helpful to be able to set up the chronology, to set up a change in continuity over time technique, to be able to set up just a prompt that tells you a specific date, and you need to be able to keep it within those prompts, or within those dates for the prompt. So 1787, the first date, 1787. Anybody got an idea as to what that would be? That's all the way in period 3, a very important date in period 3 that I would for sure know. This is one of the big ones in American history. And actually, Lincoln, President Abraham Lincoln, before he was president, once famously said that he thinks that the Civil War became inevitable once 1878 happened and they didn't solve the issue of slavery right then and there. So 1878 is going to be the date that the U.S. Constitution was written. That's a big deal, partly because there's some stuff about slavery in the U.S. Constitution. Now, the word slave is never used very critically, but it was a very important part of uniting the North and the South. They kind of kicked the can down the road. They said, okay, we're going to discuss the slave trade in a couple of years. In 20 years, we'll discuss the slave trade. But for now, we're not really going to mention it a whole lot. Although there are 2 bits that deal with slavery, even though they don't mention it explicitly. That's going to be, in 1787, the 3/5 clause, as well as, the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, I know what you're thinking. Maybe if you've studied this already, 1850 has a fugitive slave law in the Compromise of 1850. What's this all about? Remember, the Constitution has its own fugitive slave law embedded in it. And the Constitution also has that 3/5 clause that allows the South or slave-owning states to be able to count slaves as 3/5 of a person as it pertains to proportional representation in the House and when it comes to counting people for taxation purposes and things like that. So that was kind of a compromise. but they kicked the can down the road, and thus they have more problems. 1793. Now, 1793 is a really nice turning point, and it gives us a really good opportunity to talk about some change and continuity over time. Because slavery earlier in American history versus later in American history, it's going to change. 1793 is kind of the tipping point, at least as far as I'm concerned, because earlier you have these American founding fathers who are not super happy about slavery. Thomas Jefferson once famously said that slavery is like holding a wolf by the ears. You don't like it, but you don't dare let it go, right? So this idea that like slavery is, it's kind of embarrassing. It's not great. We don't love it, but I guess we have to deal with it. And that's the way that the founding fathers initially thought about it. In fact, one of the reasons they were so willing to compromise all the time is that they thought slavery would eventually just go away. It would eventually just go away, like it was in the northern states, gradual emancipation. The problem is in 1793, we're going to see the invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin. And once the cotton gin happens, oh my goodness, in the words of Ken Burns' documentary on the Civil War, this is what makes slavery pay. It makes it incredibly profitable. And now everyone wants to move to the black belts. Everyone wants to grow cotton everywhere. And slaves shoot up in price. And no one's going to want to voluntarily manumit or emancipate their slaves. And they're certainly not going to let people take them away from them. Slaves become valuable. Valuable to the extent that they're worth about as much as a luxury car is today. A prime field hand anyway. So enslaved people go way up in price. And this is going to lead to all sorts of problems, especially when it comes to American politics, but also when it comes to slaves, because they're going to be sold to increasingly further south regions, and slavery conditions are not going to be great down there. So you're going to see some slave rebellions. We're going to see slave rebellions like Denmark Vesey, right, and Gabriel Prosser in 1800, and other ones that are going to happen in the 1820s. But largely slave rebellions, we need to keep that in mind, are going throughout this. There aren't that many actual armed rebellions that we're going to be talking about. We'll get one of them in this timeline particularly. But keep in mind throughout all of this, we need to keep in mind some agency for African Americans during this time period, right? Agency meaning that they have the ability to make some adjustments. They have the ability to make their own decisions. They have the ability to control some parts of their lives. Yes, slavery is terrible because it dehumanizes people and because it takes away some of their agency. But I believe it was historian Kenneth, I can't remember his name, but a historian about slavery who says slavery was always contingent on people negotiating a relationship. And so don't dehumanize enslaved people in your history class either, because you want to be talking about how they constantly fought back. Sometimes it's through armed rebellion. Sometimes it's just through being human, forming families, right? That if your masters are trying to dehumanize you, you can humanize yourself by forming families, and that's a version of resistance. Sometimes it's intentional work slowdowns. Sometimes it's breaking tools. Sometimes it's pretending not to understand directions and running away, sometimes even temporarily, sometimes armed rebellion. But throughout this entire timeline here, African Americans are going to be resisting and trying to help each other escape and help each other survive. So a couple of other things here. 1808 is going to be the end of the international slave trade. It's a slave import ban. So there's only internal slave trade from now on. So no more ships from Africa unless they're smuggling in slaves. And this means that we're going to see a lot of slaves moving from Virginia and North Carolina, where the soil has been a little bit exhausted, down to the Black Belt. That's talking Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana areas. You can see these on a lot of different maps you can find. 1820 is going to be our first major compromise, or some people have called it the appeasement. So the Missouri Compromise of 1820, or the Missouri Appeasement of 1820, the South is threatening to secede, and the North has to appease them, give them what they want, in order to make sure that they don't leave. And Mahfouz, thank you for bringing that up. We also have the Stonewall Rebellion from the 1700s. Yeah, that's another one, right? Where the slaves, South Carolina, leave and try to make it to Spanish Florida. There's a lot of examples of slaves resisting all throughout American history. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that. That's an important one as well, for sure. Missouri Compromise, that's the one that establishes a line. And keep in mind with the Missouri Compromise, it is temporary, but it lasts a long time. The Missouri Compromise arguably doesn't really get overturned until the 1850s with either Dred Scott or the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So Missouri Compromise lasts for a long time, although it scares the heck out of the founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams are still alive in 1820. They're not going to die until 1826 when, fun fact, they die on the same day, July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years to the day from the Declaration of Independence signing on July 4, 1776, which is kind of interesting. 2 founding fathers dying on the same day on July 4th. Pretty cool. But either way, they're still alive in 1820. I know, right? That's kind of crazy to think about. One of those fun facts in American history. They're still alive in 1820, and the Missouri Compromise scares them. Jefferson says it is a fire bell in the night, as in like an alarm bell goes off, and he says, whoa, this is not good for the Union. If we want everyone to stick together, this is not good, because this is not going to last forever. He kind of sees what's coming. 1831 is going to be another really important date as we get closer to the Civil War, and that's going to be 2 things that are unrelated in actual history, although some Southerners think they were related back in the day, and that is Nat Turner and The Liberator. The Liberator was first published in 1831 by a guy named William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison was a famous abolitionist, very, very radical, and he wanted The Liberator to be a voice for abolitionism, and it gets published a few months before Nat Turner's Rebellion, which happens in Virginia. It's the deadliest and slightly most successful slave rebellion in U.S. history, and a lot of people down south think that the Liberator is to blame for it. There's not actually any evidence that the Liberator ever gets into Nat Turner's hands, but Nat Turner, famous slave preacher and enslaved person who then becomes a leader of a rebellion and kills a bunch of people in his rebellion, and then ultimately gets killed by the local militia, he's captured and hanged. Many of his supporters are killed along the way. But this is a very successful slave rebellion that scares the heck out of the South and makes a lot of them want to make slavery even worse. So there's a bunch of slave codes that crack down even more. So there's some more resistance there that we're talking about. 1846, the Mexican-American War begins. This is a big deal because there was some fight over Texas, and Texas becoming a state, and we didn't have another one to balance them out with. So eventually we take over Texas in 1845, balance it out with Oregon territory a little bit. And then the Mexican-American War begins. That's also James K. Polk. He's interested in manifest destiny. He wants to take over a whole bunch of territory. And the question is, does the territory that we take over get to be slave or free? There's the famous Wilmot Proviso, where a guy from Pennsylvania, a representative, proposes that all the territory taken from Mexico be free. It doesn't pass, but it really makes the South and the North both really angry at each other. So this just, again, continues to exacerbate or make worse the sectional tensions between the North and the South. In 1848, it ends. There's the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and everyone at first is like, all right, we got all this territory from Mexico, and this is great, but what do we do with it? Well, no worry, that won't happen for many, many years, because you can't make decisions about this until they become a state. And none of these will become a state because no one lives there yet, and it'll take a long time. Turns out that's not the case. In 1848, the same year that we take this over from Mexico with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, gold is discovered in California. Leads to the California gold rush. Everyone who moves there comes in 1849, or at least a lot of people do. Thus the name 49ers, San Francisco football team, right? San Francisco 49ers, named after the people that go there for the gold rush in 1849. So California suddenly swells to this giant state with tons of people. Not as many as we think of today, but enough to qualify for statehood. They passed the 50,000 mark. So now California needs to become a state. It's really awkward. We don't have another state to balance it with. California is huge. The Missouri Compromise line doesn't work anymore. What happens? We decide on the Compromise of 1850. Now, there are some minor points to this involving popular sovereignty in Utah and New Mexico, slave trade in D.C. That's probably too minor for us right now. The big points here, the things you must know about the Compromise of 1850, nice job there naming that, historians, would be that the South gets a radically new, enforceable fugitive slave law, and the North gets California as a free state. So California is a free state. In exchange, there's a fugitive slave law that is actually enforceable. It deputizes everybody up north, makes them have to enforce it. If they see a slave, they must turn them in, and the North doesn't like it. They start passing things called personal liberty laws. They start arguing against this. They start using states' rights arguments, which is kind of ironic, right? They start using states' rights arguments to talk about how there's no such thing as now a free state, basically, because they have to return slaves that run away to them. But events continue to accelerate, and it gets even worse. 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin is published. This ticks off all the bunch of people down south, and they try to publish some books in response. But either way, this shows people up north what slavery is really like, and it starts to cultivate more abolitionists. Now, by the way, as an aside, I should probably say real quick, everybody at this time period thought that everyone up north was an abolitionist if you were from the South, and if you're from the North, you thought everyone down south was this terrible slave owner. Neither of those things is true, but the number of abolitionists is increasing, and people down south are getting increasingly interested in maintaining slavery. Now, remember what I said earlier about the Founding Fathers. They thought slavery was embarrassing. They didn't like it. They thought it was eventually going to go away. But then around this time, we have people like John C. Calhoun who say, you know, slavery is really, really profitable. Maybe we should come up with a better defense for why slavery is so awesome. And they talk about how slavery is a positive good. Then they say it's actually good for the Africans and all this really racist stuff. But they start to argue that slavery is actually good for everybody involved. So that's one of the changes you can see throughout this timeline. 1854 is going to be a very important date, probably the most important on this timeline other than, say, 1780. And that's the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which nullifies the Compromise of 1850 and the Missouri Compromise, and it leads to Bleeding Kansas, the first shots fired, and it also leads to the creation of the Republican Party. The Whigs and the Democrats, they split over this vote. Everybody who's, not everybody, but slight exaggeration, almost everybody from the North, Whig and Democrat, votes no. Almost everybody from the South, Whig and Democrat, vote yes. And that's just not sustainable for a party. The second party system collapses, and the Republican Party, basically the anti-Kansas-Nebraska Act party, comes into existence with some help from some know-nothings, Liberty Party, Freedom Party, Free Soil Party, what are known as conscience Whigs, people up north whose slavery bothers their conscience. They decide to join the Republican Party, and now we have the third party system. That's a big deal. So this is changing political parties as we get into period 5. 1857 is the famous Dred Scott case, Dred Scott v. Sanford, and this is the case where he sues for his freedom because he's been taken to a free state, goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Initially, they're just going to dismiss it because Dred Scott doesn't have standing, but then President James Buchanan kind of leans on them a little bit and says, hey, can we get a ruling here that actually goes a little bit further? And so the Dred Scott case ends up saying, first of all, black people have no rights. Yikes. Secondly, there's no such thing as a free state, essentially, because you can't deny people their property, and slaves are property, according to the interpretation of Roger B. Taney and the rest of the court. So Dred Scott v. Sanford sparks a lot of outrage. That's not good. 1858, Lincoln-Douglas debates. Bleeding Kansas is happening during this time period, and Lincoln and Douglas are having these knockdown, drag-out battles. That means that Lincoln gets national prominence. Even though he loses, he still gains a lot of following and a lot of followers, and people are beginning to notice this guy and his talking. 1860 is when he runs for president. He is eventually elected, and it was kind of a dark horse candidate at first, but Lincoln is elected in 1860, and that's going to cause some southern states to leave because he wasn't even on the ballot. They're worried that he's going to take their slaves. South Carolina secedes the same year in December of 1860. This is where knowing some of those dates are important. Lincoln is elected in November of 1860. He's inaugurated in March of 1861. And by the time he's inaugurated, 7 states have already seceded, the deep, deep South: South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. 1861 is when South Carolina, I apologize. That's when the rest of the states secede, and then there's Fort Sumter, and we have the start of the Civil War. So all of this is this giant timeline, and man, this is really bothering me. I feel like it's going to bother you too if I don't fix this right now. 1861 is when we have a bunch of people who are able to secede from the United States, which the Supreme Court later decides is treasonous. It's not constitutional. And so the Deep South secedes in 1861. South Carolina has already seceded, so we'll add that back in there, make that correct. And then we have the whole Civil War. So this is a lot of the, again, this whole thing is putting this in context, and it's all about African Americans. It's all about slavery. Are there other things going on? Sure. We're just talking about African American history as it relates to period 5. So that's the American Civil War. I want to stop there real quick because we just covered a lot of ground, and we're about to dive into the Civil War and maybe some stuff that you haven't covered. Maybe you've covered a lot of this stuff so far, but maybe you haven't covered some of the other stuff. I know I haven't in my classes. So let me stop here. Any questions that you have so far? A really nice review question to ask might be something like what leads to increased tensions, et cetera, et cetera. Lena's asking about the Back to Africa movement. Yeah, I want to make sure that I'm using my terms correctly here, so maybe look this up a little bit. But I believe the phrase "back to Africa" is going to be used a bit later. We're talking Marcus Garvey and the 1920s. There is the American Colonization Society during this time period, which is very important, and that's going back to Africa. It's a little technical, but I'm just trying to make sure that we use the right terms here. The American Colonization Society says, yeah, let's free some slaves, but they couldn't live here or anything. Maybe because white people are too racist, but maybe because black and white people just can't get along, which is unfortunate. And that's what a lot of people think. So Henry Clay is a part of that. Even Abraham Lincoln thinks, yeah, maybe black people should just go back to Africa. Eric Foner has a fantastic book on Lincoln where he talked about that. And he says, yeah, black people and white people can't really get along, mostly because white people are so racist, so they should all just go back to Africa. Problem, of course, is many of them haven't lived in Africa, and that's not really where they're from in terms of where they've actually lived. There is some success in bringing back former slaves to Sierra Leone from the British. So the Americans try to do that, and they form this country called Liberia, and they kind of reverse Columbian exchange people there, and they kind of colonize local Africans with African Americans. It's not a great situation. But yeah, Lena, thanks for mentioning that. There is this idea of bringing African Americans back to Africa during this time period. Yeah. Any other questions that I can help to answer about this so far? Otherwise, we can keep moving on and talking about your period 5 overview. So again, remember period 5, if you break it up into 3 parts, it's the road to the Civil War, it's the Civil War itself, and then it's the aftermath of the Civil War. We focused more of our time on the road to the Civil War because this is probably where you are, and we need to make sure we have some good context here. Let's keep going. Next, secession happens, and I thought we'd look at a couple things. Sometimes people wonder, what caused the Civil War? Why did secession happen? Turns out there's this fantastic document. It's basically the Declaration of Independence from the state of South Carolina that says a declaration of the immediate causes which induce, cause, and justify, make it okay, the secession of South Carolina. So they literally tell us why they're leaving. It's really nice. If you look at the first paragraph, it says, we assert that 14 of the states, the northern ones, have deliberately refused to fulfill their constitutional obligations. And then the second paragraph talks about the fugitive slave law and how the North is not doing this. That would be called personal liberty laws. So 14 states are passed these personal liberty laws. They're not following the Fugitive Slave Act, and thus the laws of the general government have ceased to affect the objects of the Constitution. In other words, South Carolina's like, we're seceding because the Constitution is not giving us what we want. So it's kind of ironic when some people talk about the Civil War being caused by states' rights. They're actually a little bit oppositely wrong, right? South Carolina is actually complaining that there are too many states' rights up north. Now, maybe are they claiming a state's rights to own slaves? Sure, one could perhaps argue that, I suppose. But keep in mind that they do not like these personal liberty laws, and they really, really are getting mad that the Fugitive Slave Act is not being enforced. In case you were a little bit more confused, a couple of other primary sources that might be useful we can practice reading through a little bit. This is the so-called Cornerstone speech by Alexander H. Stephens. He was the vice president of the Confederate States of America. He knows what he's talking about. He's in Georgia, March 21, 1861. So Lincoln has been elected. He's been inaugurated, and the South has started to secede. And notice he's going to talk about what the Confederacy is all about. He says, our new government is founded upon exactly this idea. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. Wow. And then in the second paragraph, he talks about how white people are all equal in the eyes of the law, kind of trying to do that racial bribe thing, right? Trying to make white people, even poor whites who don't own slaves, on his side. But he says, not so with the Negro. Subordination is his place. It is indeed in conformity with the ordinances of the Creator. He's even using God and biblical imagery. He's twisting it to be able to justify slavery. So the Confederacy was built on white supremacy, and then they're twisting Christianity to justify their existence as well, which is not great. So secession happens in 1860. It happens in 1861. Couple examples of some primary sources there, just in case you needed to look. By the way, you can look up the other states too. Every state that secedes has a declaration that says why they're leaving, right? So that might be helpful just in case you need to have a discussion about what caused the Civil War. They tell you. So that's secession in 1860 and 1861. We're off to the Civil War races. And let's talk about just the context of what we've seen so far. Controversies over expansion of slavery westward and increasing sectional tensions over slavery, etc., led to the Civil War. That's a really big context for what we just talked about, and that's what was happening with African Americans in the Antebellum Era. Now we're into the Civil War. Let's talk about that a little bit. So Civil War geography, the Union, the United States, those are the blue states up north, and then the states that secede pre-Fort Sumter are the Deep South states. We're talking right here. These are the ones that secede before Lincoln is inaugurated, and then once Lincoln decides to use force to be able to put down the rebellion, the upper four states will leave as well. The yellow states are the border states. And again, you might not have covered this yet. You will maybe soon. Yellow states are going to be border states, aka slave states that stay in the Union. So that'll be important for later. So it's not you don't have to memorize a ton of geography in APUSH just for its own sake. But knowing some of these places are very, very helpful for especially talking about movement, talking about battles, talking about why things are border states, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, look, there's California, right? And all the trouble that it caused with the Compromise of 1850. So brief overview of the Civil War. There's a lot of stuff you could go into, right? But just for our sake here, I want to cover a couple of highlights, things you need to know for APUSH, and then things you also need to know for our purposes here when we're talking about African Americans and the context here. So slavery is the context for the Civil War. What does that mean for the Civil War itself? There's some key victories that you should be familiar with. And if you're taking some notes during this presentation, it might not be a bad idea to write these down somewhere, or at least put them in your mind, because I know I haven't talked about these in my class yet, but I will very soon. And it's a good idea to be able to know these battles, because they're all important, not just for military history, but for the rest of APUSH as well during this time period. So first we have Antietam. Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history, actually still to this day. Antietam is going to happen in 1862. And the reason that's so important is because even though it's a draw, even though the United States doesn't technically win, Lincoln claims it as a victory and then uses it to launch the Emancipation Proclamation, which is the initial thing that tries to free some of the slaves. It also keeps Europe out of the war. Europe is considering helping the Confederacy, partly because of their supply of cotton. But after Antietam, they go, it doesn't look like the South is going to be able to win very well. And also, we don't want to fight for slavery. And Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation has declared this war to be about freeing the slaves, which is a little bit of a pivot from the beginning. I mean, the Civil War was always about slavery, but Lincoln's primary goal was to preserve the Union, bring them back in. But at this point, he begins to make it about slavery, where he starts to talk about his powers as commander-in-chief to be able to take away people's property if they're using it for rebellion or treason, and slaves were considered property, so he's going to use it that way. So Antietam is really important for that reason. We got Vicksburg and Gettysburg that actually happened in the same days in July of 1863. Vicksburg is going to give the North control of the Mississippi River and promote General Ulysses S. Grant. Gettysburg, probably the most famous battle of the Civil War, is the bloodiest battle. Happens over 3 days, so that's how it kind of beats out Antietam there. And it's going to be the Confederate high water mark. It's the farthest north they ever get. If you're ever near Pennsylvania and you get to visit Gettysburg, I've done so twice. I highly recommend it. Gettysburg is going to be a time when General Lee from the South definitely loses. He loses a third of his army, and it's basically all defensive from then on out. And also, crucially, it leads to Lincoln issuing the Gettysburg Address a couple days later in the dedication to the cemetery to the wounded there, where he lays out this vision for American ideals going forward. Last but not least, we have Mobile Bay and Atlanta in 1864. Those both lead to Lincoln getting reelected. You'll notice that this war lasts for about 4 years. And after the big battles of Vicksburg and Gettysburg, those were turning points, but only really in retrospect. And people were getting kind of sick of this war. So they were saying, hey, Lincoln, what's up? Why can't you win this war? And they were maybe not going to vote for him. Wait a minute. Lincoln was running for re-election in the middle of a civil war? Yes, he was, which is kind of cool and shows the robustness of the Constitution, at least in some aspects. So he's running for re-election, and Mobile Bay and Atlanta are big victories that happen at a crucial time, late summer, early fall, and thus he's able to get those presents, essentially, campaign victories, and thus people are able to vote for him. Largely soldiers, by the way, are going to be the ones that put him over the top. And then he's able to be reelected, which means that he'll actually finish the war all the way to the end and get rid of slavery. His opponent, George McClellan, was like, well, maybe we'll just end the war and not get rid of slavery. But Lincoln getting reelected means we're going to end the war and end slavery once and for all. Also, you want to talk about resources and infrastructure. Keep in mind that the South was plowing all of its capital, all of its money into slavery, and so they didn't have a lot of money to put into things like railroads or factories or businesses, and that makes them eventually not do so well with the Civil War because they don't have railroads to move goods and materials and men around, and they don't have a lot of factories. And so their infrastructure is definitely going to be lacking. So, brief overview of the Civil War and some stuff you should know there. African Americans play a crucial role in the Civil War. Not a single African American is drafted, and yet over 100,000 African Americans serve in the Union Army, which is amazing. All volunteer, which is pretty cool. So, where does that come from? Well, Lincoln has some American ideals that he's going to be talking about. New birth of freedom is the phrase that he uses in the Gettysburg Address. The Emancipation Proclamation says all slaves who are in territories that are in open rebellion are free from here on out, which, fun fact, means that basically it applies to nobody because it's applying to the people that aren't listening to Lincoln right now. So slaves, in order to be free, have to free themselves. They have to run away. And then after the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect January 1, 1863, they're able to join the Union Army. So you're going to see famous battalions like the one you see in the lower left-hand corner. They're storming Fort Wagner there. That's going to be the 54th Massachusetts, that famous colored regiment that is led by Robert Shaw, and he's a white officer. So they're going to be allowed to fight, but in segregated units and under white officers. So there's a lot of racism still going on. But remember, Lincoln's able to use this contraband idea, this idea of using slaves. If you have enslaved people and you're using them to rebel, he can take them from you as commander-in-chief because you're using it to commit a crime, and then he frees them, and then frees them to be able to fight for the United States. So African Americans play a crucial role in the Civil War, a great source of manpower for the United States, the Union. All right. Then we get to Reconstruction. And I want to pause there real quick, just go back here. African Americans in the Civil War in general. Again, you probably haven't gotten there yet. I haven't gotten there with my class yet. I'm just kind of setting the stage here, talking about what happens with African Americans. Any questions so far about African Americans, the Civil War, big stuff like that I can help to answer right now? Lincoln is going to make sure that he talks about big ideas like the new birth of freedom in the Gettysburg Address, like freedom in the Emancipation Proclamation. His second inaugural address talks about unity, bringing the country back together even as we get rid of slavery. Pearl asked a great question. Yeah, what is contraband? So contraband is any sort of possession that is used for illegal purposes. So, for example, if you are selling drugs out of your car, the police can arrest you, take your drugs, and they can take your car. They can confiscate it. Right? So contraband is what Lincoln says. Lincoln says, oh, you think slaves are property? Well, guess what? You're using your slaves, your property, to be able to rebel because they're providing for your farms while you go off and fight. So you're using property to be able to commit treason against the United States, which is a crime. So therefore, I'm going to impound your slaves, essentially. I'm going to take your slaves, confiscate them, and then I'm going to free them and allow them to fight for the United States. So that's what contraband means. Has to do with Benjamin F. Butler. He's one of Lincoln's generals. He tries to deal with, what do we do with all these slaves that are running away to our Union lines? And then they decide to call them contraband of war as a way to be able to hurt the South and add to Union manpower. Lena asked a question, did Union naval power ever block Southern exports like cotton during the war? Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we'll see this, I think, in the next slide. Or maybe I skipped over that, sorry. But the Union Army Union Navy, the United States Navy is going to try this thing called the Anaconda Plan, where they try to blockade southern ports. Now, initially, they're not super successful, mostly because it just requires so many ships to be able to blockade the entirety of the South. But they are able to blockade a lot of these major ports. So your Savannah, your Charleston, South Carolina, your Mobile Bay, New Orleans, places like that, Norfolk, Virginia, they're all going to be blockaded, and it'll gradually be added as the Civil War goes on. That's one of the reasons why they have Mobile Bay and New Orleans and Vicksburg, and the United States is working up the Mississippi River. Yeah, so Union naval power is going to try to block Southern exports. They're going to try to smuggle it to Europe anyway. They have these blockade runners. and there's a lot of back and forth cat and mouse game. Largely, their success, the United States is successful in blocking much southern export of cotton during this time period. That's why the South invents those ironclads, and the North does too. So the Monitor and the Merrimack, we get these ironclad ships, aka ships with iron on the sides that are able to fight back against each other. And that's going to be an important invention during this time period. Industrialization leads to all sorts of new warfare technology, right? Yeah. All right. If there are no other questions, oh, here we go. What were some acts of African Americans that aided more into their freedom? Yeah, so I would say, I mean, you don't want to forget about the Underground Railroad, right? Harriet Tubman is probably the most famous conductor of that, but she also is a spy during the Civil War. So African Americans beforehand, if they're aiding their freedom, they're either running away, and then after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, they're running away to Canada, not just the North. They're going to be doing slave rebellions, slowing down, stuff like that we talked about earlier. Slaves just resisting in their own little way. But then in terms of helping to gain their freedom, I would say the primary ways are, like we said, running away and then joining the Union Army. Hundreds of thousands of people need to be in the Union Army, and over 100,000 of that is going to be African-American soldiers after the Emancipation Proclamation. So African-Americans will certainly fight tenaciously, fiercely for their own freedom and for the freedom of their fellow members of the African-American formerly enslaved groups. Yeah. Underground Railroad's a good one. They also continue to pressure Abraham Lincoln. People like Frederick Douglass are going to continue to meet with Abraham Lincoln, urge him to pass the Emancipation or to write the Emancipation Proclamation, to help pass the 13th Amendment that'll eventually get rid of slavery altogether. So they're doing all sorts of things. They're fighting, they're advocating, they're running away, etc. Great question. Alrighty. Let's finish ourselves off with Reconstruction and a couple of practice questions, as well as questions from you. Again, if you have any questions as we're going along, feel free to ask those as we go. Throw them in the chat, wherever you need to. So, Reconstruction. The war ends in 1865, and there are three really big questions facing the United States at this point. First one, what should the United States do with the rebels, the former Confederates? Do we hang everybody that committed treason by rebelling against the United States? That seems impractical. What do we do with the freedmen? We have 4 million new freed African Americans. What do we do with them? How much do we help them? And then third question, who gets to decide that? The president or Congress? President Lincoln is the first president during this time period, but then he is, remember, assassinated in April of 1865. His vice president takes over. Does anyone know who his vice president was? Who was Lincoln's vice president? Go ahead and drop that in the chat if you think you know who it was. I'll even give you a hint. There's his picture. So Lincoln was in charge of Reconstruction when he was commander-in-chief during the war, but then he gets shot, and then this guy takes over. And I'm going to give you 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This would be Andrew Johnson, his vice president, who then becomes president. Never supposed to be president, but much to the disappointment of many people, he becomes president during this time. We have two other members here, and this would be some really, really deep ones. These two gentlemen are both leaders in Congress of the Republican Party, sometimes called radical Republicans during this time, and they're going to fight against Johnson for control of Reconstruction. Their names are Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens. You may recognize Charles Sumner as the guy who got beat over the head with the cane by Preston Brooks. If you haven't seen that, you might see that pretty soon. But Sumner was a very vocal slavery critic kind of guy, and he gets beat up on the floor of the Senate because of it. And so he will come back to the Senate, and he's very, very anxious to punish the South and to protect the freedmen, whereas Johnson is not. So there's some big questions there, and they have a lot of different answers. Everyone has their own plan. I'll let you get into that a little bit more later in your classes, in other 5able streams. There's some more detail there, but I just wanted to give you some big overviews of the Reconstruction questions. Then let's talk about how they end up solving these, or attempting to solve some of these problems. So Reconstruction changes the United States in a variety of ways, one of which is that federalism is going to shift. The federal government, that is the national government, takes on a whole lot more power over the states, partly because of wartime powers and partly because the South is now defeated, and they don't get to make this whole states' rights argument for slavery, and the North no longer has to have states' rights for personal liberty laws, and Lincoln has consolidated a lot of power in the presidency as well as in the federal government. Then there are some official constitutional changes too. There are 3 amendments that are passed during Reconstruction that we'll need to talk about. 13th Amendment is the first one. It outlaws slavery, allegedly, except for that picture on the lower right-hand corner. The 13th Amendment, by the way, fantastic documentary on Netflix. I can't recommend it highly enough, called 13th, is the story of the 13th Amendment and how it has a loophole that is then exploited. The loophole in the 13th Amendment is that slavery is illegal except for punishment of a crime. So what do? Well, you create the myth of black criminality and then assume that all ex-slaves are all criminals, and then you arrest them for trivial or non-existent offenses, and then you throw them in jail and you make them work for you in a system called convict leasing, aka prisoner renting. So that's the loophole in the 13th Amendment, unfortunately. The 14th Amendment allegedly gives equal citizenship, and the 15th Amendment allegedly gives voting rights to black males. But like I've already said, there's a lot of loopholes. I would know the constitutional amendments, these 3 for sure, as well as their loopholes. So we mentioned a couple of these. Convict leasing already. The black codes, those were laws passed during this time period that only apply to black people, saying things like they can't own guns, they can't own houses in particular places, they can't meet in large groups, they must work for a white person, otherwise they get convicted, things like vagrancy laws, etc. The KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, is going to be a big deal during this time period because they're going to run around and try to intimidate people, and thus you can't have your rights if you're worried about your life, and that's a problem. And then sharecropping. A lot of African Americans after the war are wondering, what am I going to do with myself? I have all these skills in farming, but I don't have my own land because that was never a part of the United States' federal government position, except for that whole 40 acres on a mule idea by General Sherman, but that gets rescinded by both President Lincoln and President Johnson, unfortunately. And so all these slaves who have been working for years and years and years and years and years, they get nothing. And the one thing they needed was land, and they're never given any land. So they end up having to rent from their former masters in a process called sharecropping. It keeps them in debt, and it basically means slavery by another name, which is another great documentary, by the way. That's about convict leasing. The 15th Amendment says you have voting rights, but it doesn't say you have voting rights. It actually uses the opposite language. Think about the large loophole this creates. It says you cannot deny someone the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That's it. If you want to deny someone the right to vote based on any other characteristic, you're more than welcome to do that. So eventually, after Reconstruction ends, we're going to see things like poll taxes. Oh, I'm not telling you can't vote because you're black. I'm saying you can't vote because you're poor. Well, we didn't give them any land, so is it any wonder that some of them are pretty poor? Secondly, we're going to have things like grandfather clauses. Oh, you can only vote if your grandfather voted before 1865. Well, all the black grandfathers used to be slaves, so doesn't happen to them. How about literacy tests? We're eventually going to have literacy tests. Oh, I'm not telling you can't vote because you're black. I'm saying you can't vote because you're not smart enough. Now, did I give you an impossible test? Sure. When you passed the test, did I pretend you didn't and found a way to make sure that I said no and then ripped it up? Sure. Am I giving you an unfair advantage to white people by not making them take the test? Sure. But that's what they were doing. So a lot of loopholes in the amendments, although they're going to set important foundations for later. MLK is famously going to essentially say, these amendments are checks, and I'm here to cash them. We've never actually cashed them, but let's talk about that a little bit later. So Reconstruction changes the United States in a variety of ways. And then last but not least, African Americans after the Civil War, they do a lot of stuff. Mufuz, let's go back real quick. This is a little bit detailed. I don't think we need to get into too much of this right now because you will get into this in your class probably in the future. But basically, because of the Civil War, because of Lincoln's strong leadership, and because of the way that war just tends to consolidate power, federalism is the balance of power between the national and the state governments. And during the Civil War, the national government gains a whole lot more power. Lincoln suspends habeas corpus, which means he can arrest a bunch of people. He has to direct the national mobilization of all these people. He has to organize the military. The national government has to organize the supplies to keep the military going. And so there's going to end up being this really big shift of power where the national government becomes really, really important. I believe the famous phrase is going to be that before this is actually from National Treasure, but that before the Civil War, people would say the United States are, and after the Civil War, they say the United States is. And so the United States not being a collection of small states, but rather being one united union country, it becomes a rather big deal during this time. And then Lena talking about the Freedmen's Bureau being a good example of federalism, increased federalism. Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, the Freedmen's Bureau is an example. I didn't talk about this in the brief overview here, but the Freedmen's Bureau is an example of an agency created by the national government to help out ex-slaves, and that's a whole new thing. The federal government didn't used to help out people after anything really before. And Mahfouz, yeah, sorry. Federalism is different than the Federalists. So Federalists, those would be the party of Hamilton, of Adams, etc. And they haven't existed for quite a while. So they're going to be from 1787 and 8 when they want to be all about the constitutional ratification through the time of Washington's presidency, and then they're not going to be elected at all really after 1815 in the Hartford Convention, and then there's the Area of Good Feelings and they go away. So that's the Federalists. This is federalism, which is super confusing. Sorry, I didn't create the terms. Federalists believe in more power for the national government, but federalism is just the sharing of power. So we're not talking about the Federalist Party anymore. Now, I'm glad you asked that question because I'm sure there are a bunch of other people that had that question too, because it's confusing terms for sure. Yeah. And then one more thing I was going to talk about with Reconstruction is African Americans after the Civil War. There are these two guys. Awesome. We'll talk about them in just a second. Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce. I always mix up his name. Sorry. These are the first two African American senators. So keep in mind, by the way, as we're talking about African Americans, sometimes it can be really easy to victimize them or make it seem all doom and gloom, or they were all poor and downtrodden and uneducated because of slavery. But that's not true at all. And although there was a lot of oppression going on, there was also a lot of resilience going on. And so African Americans were able to fight back. They were able to do amazing things after the Civil War. And some of it is getting elected to state legislatures, national legislatures. These people were in the U.S. Senate during the Civil War, after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, which is amazing. First African American senators. We're going to see people like Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Booker T. Washington. They're going to be leading African Americans after the Civil War, rallying them, fighting for rights, etc. You'll talk about those guys more later. Don't forget about black ladies as well. These people are going to be working together for rights for African Americans, but also for women's rights. There's going to be some important discussions there. You'll get to that later. There's places like Mound Bayou and the Exodusters. These are places that the ex-slaves are going to go and be successful. So Mound Bayou is a town created in Mississippi by a bunch of freedmen. They start to form communities. And then the Exodusters are going to be people that move out west, and they're going to look to start a new life. So this is the time of the cowboys and things like that. So a third of cowboys are going to be African American. And a lot of these Exodusters, which is a clever combination of Exodus, as in leaving slavery, like from the Old Testament, and dust, like moving out west, I guess that's what I always think of. So Mound Bayou, they form communities. Exodusters, they move out west. They gain new land. They gain new jobs, new opportunity, kind of a fresh start, which is why a lot of people move out west. So African Americans after the Civil War are going to be doing a lot of awesome stuff despite some of the things that are standing in their way, or at least attempting to. So just to kind of sum up, got a couple practice short answer questions for you that summarize some of the really, really big issues that we've talked about so far. One, you could ask this question. Briefly describe how one specific event led to increased sectional tensions between 1820 and 1860. You could mention anything that was on that timeline, but again, you want to be thinking about that. If you haven't heard of this before, the ACE acronym, I don't know if you folks have used that before, but either way, you want to drop some specific vocab, you want to tell us what the vocab means, and you want to say how it increased sectional tensions. So you'd say the Kansas-Nebraska Act was an act, exactly, Mahfouz got it, answer side explain. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was an act that gave the opportunity for popular sovereignty in lands out west as to whether they would have slavery or not. This was incredibly controversial and led to increased sectional tensions because they literally fought a war over Kansas. Or you could talk about how it led to the creation of the Republican Party because they didn't like Kansas-Nebraska. Something like that. You want to make sure that you're answering this fully. Second question, briefly describe one way in which the lives of African Americans changed between 1861 and 1865. Sorry about the typo there. This is during the war. So you could talk about how they run away, they're labeled as contraband, they're freed through the Emancipation Proclamation, lots of options there. And then another way to put it would be how their lives of African Americans changed between 1865 and 1877. This is during Reconstruction. If we're keeping in mind the larger context of African American lives, you would talk about how in 1865 they might get free, but they don't have all the rights yet, and then you have to pass the 14th and the 15th Amendment to give them citizenship and to give them some voting rights. You could talk about the loopholes. You could talk about how they move west. You could talk about how they form communities, how they join the government, etc. So there's a whole bunch of different options for that. Again, here are the options for you if you're looking for that, and if you want to watch these later. If you have that 5 Plus membership, you can always look through some of these slides later and then answer the practice questions. Not a bad idea. That's all that I have for us tonight. Hopefully that gave you a brief kind of crash course overview in an hour of what Period 5 looks like and how African Americans are sort of a constant thread throughout it. It's a really great way to contextualize. You could also talk about economic stuff. You could talk about how the Civil War causes the United States to industrialize even more than the market revolution. But this is just the one way we decided to do it. So any questions, concerns, things that I can help to answer on this Monday night for you before we start heading out? You folks have been great. Thanks for the contributions, for the help in the chat, for your patience with me as I've needed to take a couple of drinks of water and correct a few typos and slides and things like that. If we don't have any final questions, then I think we're all set to go. Thanks for joining us. You folks are awesome. Continue to have a great Veterans Day. Thanks for tuning in, and good luck on your APUSH classes as you go forward. We'll see you again next time. And Mahfouz, I hope your test goes well very soon. Let us know if we can help with that, and feel free to tune into the next ones too. Oh, actually, you have a question. Let's talk about that. So you have a test for chapter 11, 12, and 13 about policies. I don't know, what textbook are you using? I don't know what policies you're talking about, because there could be a variety of different ones. Is this the Civil War era and Reconstruction? Is it just before the Civil War? Because if you're talking about policies before the Civil War, my guess is you'd want to go back to the timeline there and looking at, if I go back to the timeline real quick, this one right here. Okay. Monroe, Jefferson, and Jackson's policies. Okay, so you're talking a long time before this. Yeah. I would probably be talking about period 4. You're in period 4, so I would talk about big themes that happen there. So be thinking about big issues like the road to the War of 1812. So Jefferson and Madison are going to deal with that. So the Embargo Act. How should the United States respond to French and the British? You could talk about the market revolution happening in the background, policies with Jackson regarding the Trail of Tears, the war on the bank, the expansion of democracy. Monroe was during the era of good feelings, but even that's during, there's the Missouri Compromise during the era of good feelings. So there's still this constant idea of people moving out west and having to decide what happens with slavery. You could talk about policies regarding internal improvements, infrastructure, and the Second Bank of the United States kind of connected with that. And then Jackson and the bank veto, the specie circular, items like that. That'd be a good way to go there. Yeah. All right. Thanks again for joining us. Hope you folks have a great night. And nullification crisis is another great one to talk about. Thank you, Lena. That'd be good. And all right. I think there are some other 5 broadcasts on the age of Jackson and Jefferson. If you want to look into those specifically, Mahfouz, that might not be a bad idea, for sure. All right. Have a great rest of your night, folks, and I hope you're able to do well on your next parts in APUSH. Have a good night.